New York, LA, Chicago, DC. The American metropolis is undergoing a renaissance.
It's where tech workers want to come, it's where lawyers are going, it's where consultants tend to work. And as a result, cities have not only become very rich, they've also become very expensive to live in.
And it's especially difficult for parents to afford. Here's how American families were pushed out of cities and what it means for urban living.
The American city was an invention of the Industrial Revolution in the late 19th century. It was a place where workers, typically male workers at the time, could come and work in factories and live in apartment buildings really close to those factories, and their families would often live with them. So in many ways, the birth of the American city was a place for families to come together.
Today, that's not the case. While American cities are more safe and more glitzy than ever before, that's not attracting families as much as it's calling to a young, professional crowd.
There are some demographic groups who are more likely to live in these high-density urban neighborhoods today than they did in 2000. Young people, particularly those in sort of 30s and early 40s range, especially if they are more educated and if they don't have kids who are school age.
I saw this really clearly when I was looking at census data with Brooklyn. So if you look at Brooklyn's population, it over-indexes in the share of its population that's under 5 years old. That means there's a lot of babies in Brooklyn. But it under-indexes in the population between 5 years old and 18 years old. In human speak, that means that there's a lot of people who move to Brooklyn, get married, have that baby, and then bounce to the suburbs by the time their baby's 5 or 6 years old.
There are some factors that could explain why there are fewer school-aged children in cities.
The first is just space. You can afford more space if you move out to the suburbs, and young kids just love to play in a lot of space. The second is housing costs. Housing is really expensive in dense, rich cities. Number three is the quality of education. It is not necessarily the case, but people often think that it's the case, that public education in cities is worse than public education in suburbs. And then finally, I think it's important to point out that it might be easier to raise your children in the suburbs where you are surrounded by people who are also parents of children of the same age.
On top of all these factors, cities are already contending with low fertility rates. In fact, the fertility rate is at its lowest point in American history.
It's really an international phenomenon. In just about every single country that develops past a certain point where you have rising education, and in particular rising education and labor force participation among women, you tend to see fewer babies per household, fewer births per woman or per couple.
So what does this all add up to?
You have high-paying jobs concentrated in cities, but you also have a situation where it's harder and harder to raise a family in those areas, because it almost forces individuals to make a choice, capital or kids. And so that's a huge equity problem. You want to make cities more inclusive for the middle and lower classes so they can reap the social mobility rewards that cities have to offer, and you can't offer that in a city that's totally inhospitable to family creation.
This could be contributing to the social and political divide between urban and rural areas.
I also think that there's a problem at a cultural level. Single people living in cities that have enormous sort of cultural power, not understanding family life. And so the rural countryside becomes like angry at the city, but they are living entirely different lives. One is, maybe raising families, albeit in a more sort of social conservative setting. And the other is inhospitable to families, even though they're sort of socially and economically liberal.
Could the federal government play a role in making cities more family-friendly?
I do think that the federal government could say double, triple, quadruple the child tax credit, effectively making it cheaper for families, especially families with young children. You should care about equity. You should care about families being able to stay in cities where the highest paying jobs are. I think it's a huge problem that people have to choose between two elements of life that should be relatively compatible in the richest country in the history of the world. Hi, it's Derek. Thanks for checking out the series. Don't forget to subscribe, and if you have a moment, please check out my previous video on how we're all working ourselves to the point of burnout.